essentially two human nature myths that I've come across. The first is that certain differences amongst particular groups of humans are innate, and this has given rise to much bad science in the fields of evolutionary biology and genetics, promoting sexist and racist practices. And the second is that particular characteristics are an inevitable part of being human. I do think most people are sincere about their assertion that humans have a fixed human nature. If we examine the historical record of the human species, we find an endless series of wars, power abuses, and corruptions. Since we recognize the pattern in history, it's very simple to assume that it's somehow instinctual or part of human nature to behave in historically recurring patterns. More specifically, it is common for people to attribute human behavior to their genetic configuration. That is, we are slaves to our genes, which predispose us and predetermine us to an inescapable set of behavioral, psychological, and mental characteristics. Human nature really, though, cannot be generalized as a set of fixed, pre-programmed set of behavioral and psychological characteristics that all people share, irrespective of the environment. As Dr. Gabor Mate says in the first part of Zeitgeist Moving Forward, the only way we can accurately and meaningfully speak of human nature is by looking at our basic human needs. On the one hand, if our basic human needs are met, meaning the bare necessities of food, water, shelter, clothing, to the psychological support, which is really no less important, we can more so expect human beings to develop into caring, compassionate, and socially aware individuals. But on the other hand, if these basic human needs are not met, which is the overwhelming majority of cases within our present society, we get a different set of characteristics that matches this environment: greed, violence, insecurity, and countless other psychological distortions. Also, the word instinct really is an empty idea, and this word essentially needs to be eliminated from our vocabulary and understanding about human behavior. People use the word when they cannot account for the source of a behavior or biological response. The word instinct masks this ignorance, exactly the same way in which free will is used to mask ignorance about the choices we make, or the sources of them, and in which God is used to explain a lack of knowledge with how the universe operates, broadly speaking. Rather than using these words, our disposition should be to find the mechanism that's actually responsible for the behavior. Physiologist Jacques Loeb condemned the use of the word instinct back in the early 20th century when conducting research on animal and plant tropisms, meaning biological responses to environmental stimuli. I will get back to this point later. And James Gilligan, in his book Violence, likewise condemns the word, explaining similarly that it is a cop-out excuse to explain behavior. Now, the first part of Zeitgeist Moving Forward addresses this thoroughly, and we're showing parts of it tomorrow. So I will focus on a few sources not discussed in the film. Dr. Robert Sapolsky, who's featured in the film, wrote a book called The Trouble with Testosterone, in which he documented the essentially negligible effect that hormones have between the wide spectrum of behavioral responses that human beings elicit, including passivity versus aggression, irrational emotion versus logic, and so forth. So we cannot explain, for example, the differences between the sexes by hormonal balances. Rather, we have genes that produce proteins which can be switched on or off by triggers from the environment. In other words, neurochemicals in the brain do not instruct us how to behave. They set propensities which must be triggered by the environment. Sapolsky uses numerous case studies, including studies with baboon troops. There was an incident among a troop he studied where the alpha males in a competitively oriented troop were killed off. The result was that within a few months, the competitive tendencies in the troop died off. And whenever new baboons were introduced to this troop, it took about 6 months to learn that that competition was not a viable method of interaction. This simply reaffirms that it is the environmental conditions that produce behavioral tendencies like competition, which I'll go more into later. In a fascinating lecture that examines the roles of genes and environment on our behavior, biologist Dr. Bruce Lipton explores the newest available evidence on this classic nature-nurture debate. Since the 1950s, the view of biological determinism, that genes control our behavior and emotions, has maintained dominance in many scientific circles. What this has led to is a feeling of powerlessness and lack of responsibility for changing ourselves. If you're a victim of your genes, why even bother to try to change yourself? It's inevitable, right? Then came the Human Genome Project, which ran from 1990 to 2000 in an attempt to determine the DNA responsible for the complexity of human functionality. The original presumptions about genes serving as a blueprint for our behavior resulted in the estimate that there is one gene for every protein in our body. And at the same time, or at the time, the estimate was 100,000 proteins. So that means 100,000 genes. And then there's regulatory DNA that controls other genes, estimated at a minimum of 40,000. So that's 140,000 genes. In 2001, the results were released, showing there were only 34,000 genes, only about 25% of the original estimate, which means the remaining genes that were expected to be found do not even exist. Biologist and Nobel laureate in physiology, David Baltimore, reflected on the implications of this finding. Unless the human genome contains a lot of genes that are opaque to our computers, it is clear we do not gain our undoubted complexity over worms and plants by using many more genes. So, with all this research, we should ask ourselves, why do these superstitious beliefs about human nature persist? To address this, we should ask another question. Who benefits? That is, who in society would want to perpetuate this dogmatic belief that humans are innately any such way? Human nature arguments are used as a way to silence dissent of the status quo. Any such criticism of the established way of doing things in society is rendered immediately invalid because it supposedly has been legislated by nature. It's just the way it is, and we can't do a thing to change it.